who are the big players in terms of the global GDP? It's Japan, it's Germany, it's US and China. Meaning, if we really are policymaker here, we could focus on 4 countries. Remember, I didn't mention India here. You're not part of those 4. That gives it 50%. But just by purely focusing on stringent regulations in those markets, they will affect the rest of the world. There's no way half of the economy would run at some kind of global framework and the other half wouldn't. Europe says reduction with 55% 7 years from now. US says 60%. And everybody is starting beating at those kind of numbers. Can you imagine that we are looking forward to regulations and prices that would reduce the carbon emission with 50, 60% in the next 7 years?
So without much ado, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming the CEO and co-founder of Snowkap, Mr. Martin Malmros.
Thank you. Well, I hope you ate everything on your plate to keep the world a bit better. So what I thought I would do today is speak about a reason for why to do sustainability. Normally, if people like boards ask me or whatever, presidents or ministers, well, why should we focus on this? I said, you have kids. Then you need no more reason. But if you need some more reason, here are some financial ones. Let me see if this one works. Yes. So what is a carbon economy? Or we could also call it the carbon emission economy, because that's fundamentally what we are talking about here. That is where carbon emissions has a price. There's a cost to using carbon emissions. We have looked through, and I've researched a bit on what is the collaboration between GDP, gross domestic production, and you could say emission reduced gross domestic production. Let's start with what countries are focusing on, and this is the same basically globally, the strategy of how to address this. So first of all, if we want to continue to grow our wealth, if we want to continue to grow our economies, we have to decouple that growth from carbon emissions. That means for every $1,000 more in growth, we have to use less carbon. Actually, it's even worse than that because we actually have to go to 0 carbon. So we need to separate emissions from economic growth. And the main route forward is tax or trading in carbon emissions. The second route forward is to hold producers responsible for the whole value chain, meaning that you're not safe because you produce steel in India if it's consumed in Europe. There'll be mechanisms charging you for that journey. And even if you are an FMCG company and people eat your food, you still have a responsibility for the packaging after that you consume your food. And the fourth one is that we actually have overused our planet. Right now, if we take all living things, insects, fish, algae, trees, that is less in weight than what we have constructed on this planet. For the first time, this planet is now more man-made than made out of nature. And that will not work. So that's why we need to restore as well the natural carbon sink when nature captures the carbon. So how is this happening? Well, there's a strong focus on penalizing the do-nothing scenario. The companies, the consumers are saying, I don't care, I pay for it. Therefore, that price can go very high. And I mentioned $500 per ton here of carbon emissions, and I explain why I believe that is true. Look at, I don't know if you can read it from down there, but we consume around 40.8 in 2021 gigaton. That's billions, right? At that same time, a price of carbon emissions in Europe was $106. So if we would offset all of that, that's $4.5 trillion. That's a pretty interesting market for anybody to address, especially if it's tax. So don't think it's not going to happen. Is that reasonable? Well, if the global GDP is around 112 trillion, and the current, you could say, emission per $1,000 of GDP is around 300 kilo, that means at 106, a 3.2% tax at current level would actually solve the problem if we then use all that money to plant trees to restore land. That is not likely to happen, but it's a possibility, and it's actually interesting if we look at some further curves. This is what I've talked about, how many ton of carbon emitted by $1,000 of GDP growth. China is the one that's had the most radical journey for the last 40 years, right? Or 30 years, sorry. And you could see the others are kind of getting closer, and the world average is around 0.35. India's not doing that bad, actually. You are pretty much on average with the world. So what does this tell us? That is, if we move from 300 kilo to 200 kilo, which we are aiming for right now, roughly a 2% tax on all consumption could solve the problem in the sense that we use the money for the right things. Another factor that is important is who are the big players in terms of the global GDP? It's Japan, it's Germany, it's US and China, meaning if we really are a policymaker here, we could focus on 4 countries. Remember, I didn't mention India here. You're not part of those 4. That gives a 50%. But just by purely focusing on stringent regulations in those markets, they will affect the rest of the world. There's no way half of the economy would run at some kind of global framework and the other half wouldn't. So who's leading this? Well, it's Europe. And they have a strategy where they say they have to adapt to unavoidable impacts of climate change and become climate resilient by 2050. There are some differences here. China has 2060, you have 2060, 70, US. But the interesting thing is, what are the goals for 2030? Europe says reduction with 55% 7 years from now. US says 60%. And everybody is starting beating at those kind of numbers. Can you imagine that we are looking forward to regulations and prices that would reduce the carbon emission with 50, 60% in the next 7 years? It has to come with a cost and a price. So Europe says we want to do it smarter, swifter, more systematic, and more international action. And they're running currently at 0.13 ton. Actually, in Europe, we've had a decline of carbon emissions per GDP for quite some time. And I was just, as I'm from Sweden, I looked at those numbers, and there we've had a 30% reduction since 1990, despite the fact that the economy had tripled and the population has increased with about 30%. So it is possible. We are, in other terms, entering a carbon economy, and that needs to be taken into account when you develop your ESG strategy. How is that affecting you? Well, first of all, business models will change. It will be a lot of new competition. I give you an old example. That was when the mobile phone came. The producers of the weekly magazine, they sold mainly to students, young kids back then. And suddenly they saw a drop in the market. And they thought somebody else was picking up their clients. They were reading another weekly magazine. But it wasn't. They were putting the money on the phone for their weekly allowance. It will happen to a lot of the markets here as well. The car industry is facing it. Oh, we need to shift to EV. Cement, going for carbon neutral cement, steel for carbon neutral steel, and so on. So it's important to understand also that if we are now looking at India, you will have a regulatory pressure this way. You will have a demand going this way. Your supply is going the other way. And that cost of consumption in Europe and US will be pushed towards the producers in India and other global south. So just quickly to understand, the do-nothing scenario means I'll offset all of my carbon emissions. That's called carbon neutral. The other scenario is called net zero. That is when you eliminate as much of your carbon emissions as possible. Normally we talk about 90%, and then offset the rest. The thing is, if you're going to grow your business, everybody want to grow their business. If you apply the do-nothing scenario, your cost would go up, regardless if you offset it. But if you start working with reducing your carbon emissions, then of course your competitiveness will rise instead of your cost. So looking at very simplistic stages, we have material, we have energy production, production and distribution, then consumption, end of life, and what could not be eliminated. There are methods to do this, like process shift, energy shift, process design. These are the one companies we've been discussed here today should focus on, to track and trace these and do changes. Because when we get over to the GHG reduction measures, it's a lot about capture at source. That's going to happen in the future. And then we have the others, what we couldn't fix, which is increase the global sink, the 20% I talked about, direct air capture, and carbon storage. And of course, regulations will come like this. Europe has implemented 1,300 new regulations in the last 10 years on ESG. Let's look quickly into some of the solutions. We can skip this one as we're short on time. Let's look at something that's very close here. Coal. It's about 70%, I think, of your energy mix. Actually, if we look at capture at source for coal, the price has come down from 120 something, and are now for the next years in the projects that are planned in the US, down to maybe $45. So even here we see it's actually cheaper to do actions than the offset cost. Here are some differences on what does it cost to stop the carbon from leaking at source. And let's look at direct air capture, because that's the most complicated one. That cost is roughly around $140 to $340 today. But the capacity is so limited, so the price can be the double, between $350 to $700. And this is why, when we've done everything we can, the price on carbon will be determined by direct air capture and storage. And that's why $500 is not unreasonable figures to see. I talked about $4.5 trillion at $100. Now we're talking $22 trillion. If that's the on cost on 100 trillion GDP, then we're talking 20+%. Therefore, it's very important to take action soon, otherwise you are at risk. Very quickly, we know where they sit, the different parts of emissions for different type of companies. So energy consumption in FMCG manufacturing or logistics or IT or whatever. We can do that for the whole list, break it down. And we also have a good understanding, learning from, again, what's been done in other countries. How is the effectiveness of different actions? Is CapEx required? And is it difficult? With this is a good starting point, actually, just to look at your company and give you a sense of what needs to happen. Very rapidly, sustainability is no longer a trend. It's a change. It's happened. We have entered the carbon economy. Therefore, you can actually look at this as a change process. And change process is something most companies have worked with for a very long time. You have defined steps on how to do that. Technology is, of course, now supporting a lot more, giving you a lot more data to drive that change process faster, more cost-effective, and also implement it in the original or standard processes you have. Data-driven sustainability. Also there, we have already established a best practice. We know how it starts and the journey and what needs to be done. So back to the message, I said we know roughly the cost of doing nothing what could be done and what it is today, what it will end up with if we keep doing nothing, and how to avoid it, and what the actions and the methods you need to take. Mention also that in every larger transformation of our economical models and our industrial evolution, there's been peaks in capital requirements. We have the railways, industrialization, electrification, IT, renewable energy, and I mentioned Industry 4.0 because I believe ESG is part of that. To digitize, to automate, to use robots, to use AI, to produce in a more sustainable way. And that will be a fight for capital if you haven't done it. So in conclusion, it's an evolution of market economy with clear defined boundaries. We don't have unlimited resources anymore. That was never considered in the market economy when it was designed. Now we have to say it's limited. Data-driven sustainability is something that will enable you to manage new demand for detailed value chain data and to identify those change possibilities that sits in your company. Everyone is affected everywhere. No, I've never been in any country, any company that could say, we sit outside. We are not part of this. Doesn't matter if you're a lawyer, a banker, a fund, producer, service company, everybody is affected. And if you ever thought you could wait, don't wait on this one, please, because time is of essence here, not just for the planet, but for your own business, because you're into a new global situation. It's a new economy for you. That's it. Thank you.